Welcome back to the Lydia McGrew channel. I'm continuing my short series on the religious context of Jesus' ministry and how it relates to the prior probability of Jesus' resurrection. And you'll remember, if you were with me last week, I talked about the classical approach, which says that you have to argue for the existence of God before arguing for the resurrection. I said that's not the case, but it can be helpful sociologically and psychologically to certain audiences. I also said there that at a certain level, the religious context of Jesus' ministry, his coming and claiming to be the God of the Jews who revealed things to people and that he was the messenger of God, does not give us specific evidence that he really was who he claimed to be, but it channels whatever other evidence we have for the existence of a God who does communicate with people and so forth, directing our attention to Jesus. I made an analogy to a race with thousands of participants, and by analogy, the arguments for the existence of God are like arguments that there exists such a race, that it does occur, that there's a God who does sometimes communicate to people. And then the religious context of Jesus' ministry is simply arguing that Jesus entered himself in this race. But that still doesn't tell us that he was one of the genuine ones as opposed to the fraudulent ones, and there are fraudulent ones. So at that point, we hadn't gotten yet to things that I would say, apart from the resurrection, provide evidence that Jesus directly really was who he claimed to be. So today I want to talk about aspects of his religious context, his ministry, prior to the evidence for his resurrection, that I think does provide some evidence in itself that he was who he claimed to be. My main goal here is to separate out different strands of what might be meant by religious context and to try to show what I think is the correct epistemological place of those different strands in the argument. So I'm not necessarily making the arguments, though, as you'll see today, I will be, to some extent, defending the Lewisian trilemma, liar, lunatic, or Lord. I want to say something a little briefly about prior probability. In Bayesian probability, we talk about priors and likelihoods. And to some extent, that distinction is something that you just decide to make, where you say, okay, for my priors, I'm going to choose to include this evidence over here, and then I want to do what's called conditionalizing on this other evidence. And as long as you're clear about what you're including in background in your prior, so that can be critiqued if someone disagrees with that, the distinction can just be a kind of notional one. What if we had this evidence and didn't have this evidence, and then we received this other evidence? In this case of the prior probability that Jesus was who he said he was, and therefore that since he predicted his resurrection, he would rise again, prior in the chronological sense also works pretty well. So prior probability doesn't actually have to be based only on chronologically prior evidence, but that is a neat and clean way of doing it. And in this case, it works okay, because what we're talking about is evidence from the reports of his ministry and his crucifixion, reports of events that actually, if they occurred chronologically before his resurrection. So prior works in both senses here. I'm going to start by talking about the trilemma. You're probably familiar, if you're in my YouTube audience, with this argument from C.S. Lewis. And I believe it was much more ancient. I think it went back to St. Augustine in a different form, but where Lewis said that there were really only three options, that Jesus was either God, as he said he was, a liar, or a lunatic. And therefore, since these were the only possible options or plausible options based on what we know about him, we should then look at the other alternatives. He was not a liar. He was not a lunatic, and therefore he was Lord. Now, of course, this has been critiqued a lot. I was just reviewing prior to making this video, just in the last few hours, some of the negative comments that William Lane Craig has made about the trilemma. He's not fond of it. And in like several different passages in Reasonable Faith, he calls it naive and outdated in one place. So it's not even just skeptics who are critiquing it. Now, obviously, the fourth option that a skeptic will want to bring up, and even that some Christians think we should consider more plausible, is that it was a legend, and included in this would be things like he didn't really claim to be God, that those aspects of the Gospels were inauthentic, that they were added later, and especially, of course, the Gospel of John comes in for criticism here. Now, I have a whole book on the Gospel of John. I don't think we should at all shy away from claiming that Jesus really said, I and the Father are one, before Abraham was, I am, and that those do amount to claiming to be God. And it's funny because that's not even a miracle, a man standing there and saying that. So if we have good evidence that the Gospels accurately record Jesus' teachings even, then Jesus did claim to be God. Another option that has been brought up by Daniel Howard Snyder is that he was honestly mistaken because he only concluded that he was God based on his interpretation of the Old Testament scriptures. So the idea there is of Jesus sort of gradually coming. He thinks that he's the Messiah, and then he thinks there are texts indicating that the Messiah is God, and so forth. Of course, part of the problem here is that, you can always go back and question that first premise. Like if you say, well, I think I'm the Messiah, like, how Jesus came to think that, and then I think the Messiah is God, but I don't have any supernatural special reasons to believe that I am God, then that could make you, and I think it should reasonably make you go back and question if you're the Messiah. So it's not like you have to just set in stone, I'm the Messiah. Now I read, Isaiah 9, for example, and, mighty God, the Messiah is God, so therefore I must be God. It's like you can always revisit earlier premises. And so I would actually argue that anybody who concludes solely on the basis of his own scriptural interpretation that he is God without any kind of, special line to God or what he takes to be a perhaps even unique supernatural communication, is crazy. And of course, some people who think they do have special supernatural communications are also crazy. But that would be like a bare minimum that you would need. And that there is something crazy about just sitting down and, reading the scriptures of your people and concluding, hey, I must be God. There's an odd sentence I was reviewing again just before I started recording here in Dr. Craig's Reasonable Faith, 3rd edition, page 299, I believe it is. And it's kind of a Rorschach block set of sentences. It could mean a lot of different things, but it's in his discussion of Jesus' divine self-understanding. And all that I will say is that I think one could reasonably come away from it thinking that Dr. Craig is saying that the theological concept of the incarnation necessitates that Jesus came to conclude in a more ordinary fashion that he was divine. It doesn't say that, so I don't want to necessarily saddle him with it, but it would fit together with his dislike of the trilemma pretty well. I definitely don't agree, if that is what it's saying, that there's anything about the doctrine of the incarnation that requires us to conclude that Jesus came to conclude that he was God in some more ordinary fashion, such as, for example, Daniel Howard Snyder raises as plausible. And I don't think that's how the Gospels portray him. I think the Gospels portray him, consider Luke, for example, there he is at age 12. Didn't you know that I must be about my Father's business? He's already got this notion that God is his Father, and his absolute authority and confidence, I think, argue for at least a portrayal in the Gospels. And if he really was who he said he was, this would have been like a direct line to God the Father. And that's fine. I mean, there's nothing theologically wrong with that, at least. So we shouldn't box ourselves into that corner. Now, the question is, was he right or not? If I were a skeptic, I would probably go with the lunatic option. And I would just bite the bullet and say, well, there can be lunatics who appear to be very sane and sensible and who appear to be very wise and who are very charismatic and people are taken in by them. I don't think that's a good option. I really, Lydia speaking as myself, do not think that is a good option. But if I were a skeptic, that's what I would probably bite the bullet on. He was just crazy, but he didn't look crazy. Again, he doesn't look crazy. His teaching is that of a wise and learned and loving and amazing teacher and person, and also not, therefore, a liar, a charlatan, a knowing charlatan. But as Lewis argues, he didn't give us the option of stopping there. So it's kind of cool to see how the good man, good teacher intersects with the divine claims. It's like when you have good man and good teacher, that's kind of what allows you to say, no, he wasn't a lunatic and he wasn't a liar. But then you bring in the fact that he did claim to be God, and then it's like, okay, if these are the options, if these are the only options, if these are necessarily the only good options, and you've already argued that the Gospels accurately report what he said, then it looks like he was who he said he was. Again, I don't think that's absolutely decisive, but I think it raises that probability. So it contributes to the prior probability of the resurrection by contributing to the probability that Jesus really was who he said he was. So as you can see, this is arguing that he was a winner of the race. This is arguing specifically that Jesus was who he said he was. A second type of argument to that effect would be any places where miracle stories in the Gospels are especially plausible or have special marks of truth. Now, as you know, I don't go for the passage by passage approach. I don't say that that's necessary. I argue holistically for the truth and high reliability of the gospel narratives, and that they came from people in a position to know. But when it comes to miracles, there's absolutely nothing wrong with pointing to marks of truth in those specific miracle stories. So an example here would be the fact that the feeding of the 5,000 being the only miracle besides the resurrection to be reported in all four Gospels, interestingly has a large number of undesigned coincidences connected with it. And I believe it was J.J. Blunt who said, how are you going to detach the natural event that's confirmed by all of these coincidences from the supernatural event that the narratives claim was what really happened. So I think that's a legitimate point. Another just small thing, part of the cumulative case, is something I mentioned in Testimonies to the Truth. I got this from Craig Blomberg's work, where when the widow's son at Nain is being carried out and Jesus approaches her and tells her, don't cry, and then approaches the body on the bier that's being carried along. We have evidence, it's kind of cool, that in that part of the world, the relatives would walk in front of the bier. So if they're coming out of the city and Jesus and his disciples are approaching, he would come to her first. Now, I'm not going to say that's absolutely how it has to be, but I think it's a pretty neat connection with customs of the time in a miracle story. So that kind of thing is a second type of argument, part of religious context, but that more specifically points to the actual truth of Jesus' claims for himself. And then the third type of argument I want to mention briefly is argument that Jesus fulfilled prophecies up to and including his crucifixion. Again, that's still prior to any reports of his resurrection. Obviously, his crucifixion happens before his resurrection. Jason Engler on Triblog was mentioning recently concerning Psalm 22 that it assumes that the speaker is naked, because it says they cast lots for my clothes. And that's interesting because, of course, the Romans did strip crucifixion victims. There are a lot of other correlations with crucifixion there in Psalm 22. The ability to see all your bones when you're stretched out, the terrible thirst. And although there are alternative translations, they pierced my hands and my feet, I think is arguably a correct translation. Obviously, David was not crucified, so that's really interesting, really significant. And then Isaiah 52 to 53, the suffering servant, his being despised and rejected, his being scourged, being classified with the wicked in his death, and even being buried in a rich man's tomb, though that actually is probably just Jewish parallelism. He was numbered with the wicked and with the rich in his death, but kind of uncannily, we have Jesus being crucified with thieves and then buried by Joseph of Arimathea. So in various ways, we have these prophecies prior to the resurrection that you can argue Jesus fulfilled. Again, that would be part of the religious context that specifically argues that Jesus really was who he claimed to be. So I hope this series has been useful. Disentangling. First of all, we said, no, what the Jesus seminar is going to grant is not anything really significant, that Jesus, quote unquote, healed at least one blind man. That's just basically saying he was this really charismatic person believed to be a healer, because they think it was a psychosomatic healing. But then we zoomed in a little more. Jesus, coming in a Jewish context, he is claiming to be the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. His being claiming to be sent by the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That directs at least our attention to him, so that if we have other evidence that such a God exists, and that, as I put it, prophets are a thing, then Jesus is entered in that stakes for being one of them, but still not evidence that he actually was in a specific way. And then this week, for the religious context, that gives us some reason to believe that he really was who he said he was, apart from the evidence for the resurrection. Now, since I think that the evidence for the resurrection is so strong, again, I am not conceding that we have to, lift the prior up, and that if it's below this level, we're doomed, right? Evidence that is strong enough can overcome even a very, very low prior. But there's nothing wrong with bringing in evidence that raises the prior, and if it does, it's worth noting. So that's what I've been trying to do, and show how that's all cashed out epistemologically, so we don't overstate, but also hopefully don't understate. Next week, I think I'll be talking about holism in evaluating the Gospels and how that relates to miracles in the Gospels, and a skeptical approach to dismiss the Gospels because they contain miracles. So I hope you'll come back next time. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe. Please share this. Please do all that stuff, because I'd like this content to get out there. I'm Lydia McGrew.